I say this more often than not in sentencing when I'm speaking with a defendant. You are not just what brought you here today. You are not just the charges that you pled guilty to. Yeah. There's more to you. You've got family members that are sitting behind you. Even though you've had all these things, you've had all these past, experiences, there are still people that show up for you. That says something.
Welcome back to another episode of Sanctuary in the Jungle. I'm your host, Aaron Nelson. Each week on this podcast, we sit down with criminal defense attorneys to hear how they build sanctuary for their clients and what keeps them showing up to do this work. This week, we're doing something a little different. We're sitting down with a different kind of decision maker in the courtroom, Judge Mario White. For most people, the courtroom is a whole new world. The robes, the procedure, and the language can feel distant, confusing, and even sterile. Our legal system only works when the public puts trust in it, and trust requires understanding. That's exactly what Judge White has spent his career working toward, from math teacher to public defender to circuit court judge in Madison, Wisconsin. Judge White shows us better ways to explain procedure and the purpose of our system. We talk about why diversity on the bench isn't just symbolic, but essential, and how the simple act of listening and responding with clarity can make a change for people in one of the hardest moments of their life. Let's get into it. Well, welcome to the Sanctuary in the Jungle.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. We're taking this show on the road. This is the first time we've left the library in Hudson, and here we are in Madison with Judge Mario White. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're a judge here in Madison, is that right?
Yes.
Circuit court judge?
Circuit court judge, yes.
You've been doing that for about 5-6 years?
Yes, I got appointed by Governor Evers in June of 2020, and then I had to run for election again in the next year. So I'm in my first full term.
All right. And so you're up for election here in a year or two.
Yes.
And brave enough to come onto a public podcast.
Yes.
Well, thank you again for trusting us with your story. So let's maybe get into that. Obviously, now you're a judge. It took you a while to get there. Where'd you grow up?
So from Oklahoma. My family lived in southeast Oklahoma, a town called McAllister. It's about 2.5, maybe 3 hours north of Dallas. We moved there when I was in, I want to say probably 5th grade. Just me, my mom, and my sister. And I was there in McAllister going to school till about 10th grade.
Okay.
In the 11th grade, I moved to a science and math school. And so the last 2 years of my high school were in Oklahoma City, living on the dorms at University of Oklahoma, going to school there.
Oh, wow.
So that was a unique experience.
Yeah, before you get there, tell me a little bit about the town that you grew up in. It's just you and your mom and your sister.
Yep. So yeah, McAllister, it's probably about 40,000 people. It's the home of the state penitentiary.
Oh.
So there were signs on the highway that said hitchhikers might be escaped inmates.
Okay.
But yeah, so small town, kind of blue collar kind of town. The place to go to hang out was Walmart.
Wow.
That's where you would see people. I mean, it really is kind of a small town.
What'd your mom do for a living?
So she was a drug and alcohol rehab counselor.
Oh.
She also did some work in mental health.
Okay.
As a counselor. So she kind of did a lot of work with people that were going through issues.
Some tough times.
Yeah.
Was that with a government agency? Was she private in some way?
So she worked for the state for some time at a mental facility, and then she went and worked at a sort of a private company that did drug and alcohol rehab counseling.
Tell us a little bit about your mom. That must have been somebody that you were close to. She's passed, is that right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Tell us about her.
She was very outspoken and very protective. She was someone who was not afraid to let her position on something be known.
Okay.
I remember once in elementary school, I was in a music class, and this was probably like 4th grade, and kids were just sitting around talking, and I was turned around talking to someone behind me, and the teacher, for whatever reason, grabbed me by my face, turned my head around, and like starts yelling at me as if I'm the only one talking. So my mom was not happy when I told her that story.
Obviously.
And so we went to school and had a meeting with the principal and the teacher. And I don't remember much of the conversation, but I remember at one point the teacher saying to the principal, "Well, I don't have to stand for this." And my mom said, "Well, you can leave." And I thought, okay, I know where this is going to go.
Yeah.
There's certain things you're allowed to do with me as a teacher and things you're not going to be able to do. And my mom is going to make sure that those lines don't get crossed. So she was also very giving. I remember going to her college classes because she got her master's degree. So I remember I have memories of being in one of her classes when she was a student. Very vague memories because I was very young, but she managed to get her master's with 2 kids.
Wow.
Single family, and then and also being a woman of color in Oklahoma in the 80s, certainly lots of obstacles.
Yeah, were there a lot of people that looked like you and your mom?
No, not in McAllister.
Okay.
Quite frankly, not in any of the towns that we lived in.
Okay.
I would most often be the only person of color in my classes.
How much were you aware of that? How much was that something that was a part of your life?
So I wasn't really aware of it until I went to the science and math school and was actually around other kids who were non-white.
Okay.
The school had students who were of color, Indian, Native, Asian. So it was much more multicultural than what I was used to. And so when I had that exposure, I thought, oh, this is much different. I'm not the only one that looks like me.
And how was that when it was much different? I would assume it was a positive experience?
Yeah, definitely a positive experience, the ability to kind of meet other people and be exposed to different cultures and just different ways of thinking, and seeing people who have different backgrounds was just sort of an eye-opening experience for someone who's, 11th grade.
Yeah.
So
tell us about that transition, because, I'm just trying to think of myself as a 16-year-old living in my community, and obviously my community is maybe different than your community, and I might be perceived differently in my community, but to go away and to not sleep in your own bed, not to be with your mother who's been protecting you, that's, to me, I'm just that's incredibly brave.
It was an interesting experience, to go away and live in a dorm.
Yeah.
I had a roommate. It was a college life, so we had the shared bathroom in the, main area. It wasn't like we had a suite with our own bathroom or anything. And, this was a college campus. We were on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. So we were around college students.
Okay.
Our school itself is in Oklahoma City, and so we would take buses. We had our own dedicated buses that would take us from our dorm to the school and then back every day.
Did you find that scary at the time, or was it just so you're 16, maybe you don't know enough to be scared, and there's all this new stuff, and it's just wow, this is cool?
It was a little bit both.
Okay.
Because I'm away from home, I'm away from people that I know, and all my friends that I had, I don't see those people anymore. So I'm making new friends and new experiences, and we're in this new environment that is academically very rigorous. It was kind of a humbling experience to go from, I'm the top of my class, in McAllister, and now I'm at this science and math school where everybody is the top from where they came from, and now you're all together. So the school built in study hours. We had, I think at 7 p.m. was when it was time to study, and so you'd be at the dorm, and that was study time from
just what you did,
7 to 9 or something like that, and there would be a teacher from each subject that would be at the dorm that you could ask questions of, and it was, I can't underscore what a unique experience it is to sort of be away from home, to be in this setting, and the typical things that you would do in college or high school, going out with your friends on a Friday night or driving around town. Couldn't do that.
Okay.
Weren't allowed to drive.
Okay.
Unless
so
you were leaving.
Really secluded. So math and science, and now you're a lawyer. We don't get many lawyers that are like focused on math and science.
Yeah, I remember some of my law school classes, professors saying, well, if you were good at math, you wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true.
You're good at math. So you finished from I'm guessing this is a really good high school, right?
Yep.
Where do you go from there?
I went to Oklahoma State University. And honestly, I remember when I applied to college, I'm kind of a procrastinator.
Okay.
And I did the application the night before it was due. I thought, I should probably fill out this application if I'm going to go to college.
Yeah.
So I did it, got accepted, ended up doing math and history, and then a Russian minor.
Yeah, what was the minor?
Russian.
Wow. So you've got history, math, and then a minor in Russian.
Yeah.
So after school, or you get a degree then in history and in math.
Yep.
And you go out into the real world.
Go out in the real world.
What do you do from there?
So I was dating my first boyfriend at the time, and he was a year older, or still is a year older than I am, in college. And so we moved to Dallas, Texas. Okay. There were a couple other friends of mine who also moved, and we all kind of lived in the same apartment complex. There was a kind of a significant Oklahoma State contingent down in Dallas. And so I started looking for a job because I didn't have one, and I got hired at Borders Bookstore.
Oh.
And that was my first job after college. Just working at a bookstore.
Yeah.
So it was fun. I really liked it.
You eventually became a teacher, is that right?
I did become a teacher. So while I was there, I found a teacher certification program. It was long days for sure. And then I finally got to the point where I could take the certification test, passed it, and then interviewed with Dallas Independent School District and got hired.
High school?
High school.
Okay.
Yeah.
In high school math, high school history?
High school math. Yeah.
Okay. What did you find rewarding, or if anything, about working with students? Tell me about that. How was it working with students?
Just when they would get it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what my teacher meant when they said this.
Okay.
That was really rewarding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you think you as a teacher, was it just simple explanation,
No, as a teacher, it's much different.
Okay.
As a tutor, the student has a base. They've been to class. They've had exposure. As a teacher, you're the one who's laying that base. And I will say that my first year as a teacher was probably not so great.
Okay.
Because I didn't go to college to be a teacher.
Yeah.
I didn't go through the education program. And so a lot of the sort of pedagogical techniques, I wasn't taught that because I was a math major. I was a history major. I wasn't a math ed major. So my first year of teaching, I started at a school that the teacher I took over for had retired, but she hadn't separated. She was using her vacation time. And so they couldn't hire a new teacher until she separated.
Okay.
So they had substitutes that were coming in and out of the class. And so I started like October of the school year. And so by then, it had already been several months with basically no structure. So here I am, this, 22-year-old coming into this high school setting where the students have not had any consistency, any structure, and it's, here you go.
How is that coming in to that high school? I mean, was there, were they accepting of you as a person in a position of authority?
Some not so.
Okay.
These are kids who, we're talking 9th, 10th graders.
Yeah.
And all across the socioeconomic strata. So students, and also of different backgrounds.
Yeah.
You know, Hispanic students, students of color, black students, white students. So it was a challenge, partly because, you know, the students themselves, what happened was a lot of the teachers would say, well, you know what, this is the problem child in my class, and so I want them out of my class so that I can teach the rest of my students. Well, all of those students get put into one class, which was the one that I walked into. Oh. So there was a lot of issues with that. And, you know, I think I would be much better now than I was when I was 22.
Sure. Right? I mean, we're just...
Yeah.
I'd like to think we're better versions of ourselves as we get older, and we do that.
And so I actually, I remember distinctly, it was after school, I was in my classroom by myself. It had just been a really, really awful day. And I was getting kind of emotional. And I said, Mario, you are not going to cry. You're not going to do that. Like, you're not going to let this situation do that to you. So I was like, suck it up, you know, and you'll come back tomorrow. I did ultimately move to a different school.
Okay.
I landed at a school that was a magnet school. So it was similar to the one that I went to in high school, but it was not a residential school. It was still in Dallas. And so that was just a night and day experience.
Tell me about, like, what about it that you felt like you were going to cry? Like, right, what if you can put yourself back into that situation and just share with us, like, what about that experience was like hit you so emotionally that was your response?
It was the chaos of the situation. It was the fact that I felt like I didn't have, you know, the control. I didn't have the buy-in of the students.
Okay.
You know, and that's really an important thing. If the students don't buy into you as a teacher, then it's not going to work. And I didn't know how to get that buy-in because it wasn't something that I just had that experience beforehand.
How much was it due to your age or just or other parts of who you are that maybe people were judging? Are you able to say?
I think age certainly had something to do with it. You know, I wasn't too much older than some of my students, and I certainly didn't look like I was too much older than some of my students. I'm not certainly back then, not, physically
baby-faced, I'll say it.
Yeah, and so there's some aspect to that. I'm also not very aggressive and loud. That's just not my personality. So I think that all of those things kind of come together to just make someone less likely at that age to accept me as the teacher.
And I know, just moving forward a little bit, I know in your Facebook feed you'd recently posted something that, you're the first openly black a judge, which I just love your humor about someone talking about openly black, right? But you're also, as we know, openly gay.
Yeah.
How were you openly gay then at that time in 2000s as a teacher? Is that something that the students knew or you were judged on?
No, I wasn't out. So the first school, I was not. The second school I went to that was smaller, and the student body itself was much closer with each other and the teachers. There were a few students that knew I was gay.
Okay.
But I wasn't out.
Okay.
But there were a couple students that knew.
And was that influence your authority? Did that influence any of the how they perceived you, did you think, or was it accepted?
No, it was much more accepted.
Okay.
There were students that were also, gay or bi or whatever.
Yep.
And so it was a much more accepting community amongst students. So to the extent that those who knew I was gay I don't think it really impacted how they viewed me one way or the other.
How was it, if I may, how was that just growing up, right? Knowing that you were gay and maybe knowing that the community didn't accept it in some ways, America didn't accept it in some ways. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But tell me about that if you're willing to.
It was, it was weird. I mean, as a kid, I don't think I knew what being gay was.
Okay.
When I was in high school, I remember having crushes on girls. But I didn't have a girlfriend.
Okay.
And people would always ask, "Oh, why don't you have a girlfriend?" I'm like, "Well, I'm too busy." So I knew that there was something there, but I didn't quite know really what it was. And then when I graduated high school, that was kind of when I knew what the word was.
Okay.
Just
because it had been talked about a little bit more and you...
Well, I just sort of had thought about it and it's like, okay, now I know what this is. There's a word for it and I now can say it. You know, I can come out to myself.
Language is important in all of that. I mean,
Right.
I as a cisgender white man, I don't know that I have the status or standing to talk about it. From my perspective, though, I'm like, I think language to give us access as human beings to just talk about it. I don't want labels, but we still need language, right?
Right.
And that was helpful for you?
That was helpful. Once I sort of knew, okay, this is what it is, I'm sort of getting over the, religious aspect of, you're not supposed to, be gay, things like that, getting over all of that baggage. Once I was able to sort of say, okay, this is who I am, then I felt a lot better.
Okay.
So then the next step was, okay, well now I got to start how do I tell people? And so my freshman year of college, and I'd never met anyone who was gay, at least who was out.
Okay.
Not until my freshman year of college. And the first gay person I met, who ended up becoming my roommate in college and is a very good friend of mine, was gay. And so we sort of I don't know if I could say, sort of took me under his wing. As
Sure.
I know what you're going through, and
here's how it works.
And we went to one of the gay student organization meetings, which I was absolutely petrified to go to.
Sure.
I'm in this room full of strangers, and it's about being, everyone is gay, and they're talking, and I'm like, this is very scary for me because I'm sort of coming out. This process, but that really helped. Knowing someone who had sort of some of the same experiences.
Yeah, shared experience.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's just how important that is for us as humans to just know that I'm not alone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're teaching in Dallas. You're kind of trying to find your legs, for lack of a better. You're trying to figure that out. Now, looking back at that, do you see any connection now in your role as a public defender or your role as a judge, some of the things that you learned as a teacher?
Yeah. I mean, patience, listening, meeting people where they are. Those are things that, I think are true of any profession, but especially
life skills, right?
Yeah. But especially in the profession that we have, where there are consequences for decisions. And so making sure that someone understands, making sure that they get that, oh, I get it moment. Those are all things that I kind of think back on, the skills developed as a teacher.
And it seems obvious as a teacher that you want your student to get it, so to speak, right? It's your responsibility as a teacher to transfer this knowledge. I find sometimes in our job now that some people that are in a position of authority see it backwards. Like the people that come into the courtroom, it's their job to get it, and why don't they get it? As opposed to the lawyers and the judges, hey, you don't get it, but this is not your world. I'm going to transfer this knowledge to you. Does that, I would imagine that puts you in a advantageous position to be like, I'm going to teach this.
Yeah, and I think it's an important sort of way of thinking because, and I sort of say this whenever I talk with a jury, for example, after a trial, and I say, especially if it's a serious one, I say, you all don't live in this world.
Yeah.
You don't see this kind of stuff on a day-to-day basis. And so I get that this is much more difficult for you because it's not the world in which you live or operate. For us, yes, it's not like it's just, oh, this is another one of these kind of cases, but we are familiar with some of the emotional impact of these things and are better able to sort of navigate that because we've been through it before. So people that don't have that, people that come into court, for a small claims day, they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, right?
And, there is an expectation that if you are representing yourself, you are supposed to know the law. I'm supposed to treat you just like I would anyone, whether you have a lawyer or not.
Yep.
I'm not supposed to treat you differently. But I do think it's important that you spend some time just to explain.
Sure.
Educate.
Like literally educate.
Right.
Hello. Just wanted to jump in and thank everyone for listening to the episode. Those of us advocating for the underdog know how hard it can be to carry the hope. We also know that often it takes just one smile, one hug, or one small win to keep us going. My hope is that these conversations not only encourage you to keep going, but to share that energy with others, keeping the whole community moving forward. So carry the hope, share that hope with a friend, and subscribe now to join us.
And so, my ex was in law school. I'm like, well, I can do that too. So I applied to places and came to Wisconsin and sort of was on campus. And I got tricked to being here because I came to visit. It was April. And it was one of the very first really, really nice spring days.
Oh, beautiful spring day on the terrace.
Out on the terrace, the boats, the blue sky, just sitting there looking, and people are just so happy. Now I know why they're so happy. It's because they've endured a horrible winter. And, just the whole mood was just so light and exciting. And I thought, this is where I should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then fast forward to that first winter when I'm trudging through, ankle deep snow because I don't have snow boots because it doesn't snow like that in Oklahoma and Texas. I'm thinking, what am I doing here? This is insane.
Right? Like tomorrow, we're supposed to get 14 inches of snow, right?
Yeah.
They didn't put that on the
Did not put that on the brochure.
No,
that was not part of the packet I was sent.
Okay.
Yeah.
So right out of law school, is that you then apply to do public defender
right
work?
Out of law school. So I was in Michelle Leving's public defender project.
Okay.
And so I got placed in Madison in the juvenile unit because of my sort of high school teaching background.
Did that program then have an influence on you signing up to be a public defender?
Yeah, definitely. And that's what really got me to want to be in the public defender's office. And I was fortunate that there was an opening in Madison because I didn't want to move.
You wanted more April spring days on the terrace.
Yeah. And so I was able to get hired in Madison in the adult unit after I graduated from law school. And I was there for almost 10 years.
So podcast is called Sanctuary in the Jungle, right? And it's for me at least, it's about creating a place or a space where we can make better decisions but recognize people's dignity and humanity. How, as a public defender, were you, again, maybe you didn't have that same phrase, but I imagine those were things as a public defender that you were taught, that the culture was to do that. Is that something you found you were able to do as a public defender?
I mean, I would say yes, it's certainly a difficult thing to do. It's difficult from the public defender perspective. You have a role with the person sitting next to you, to tell their story in a way that humanizes them, and makes them more than just the words on a criminal complaint. It's difficult because you also have a kind of a tightrope. You have to do that, but you also have to do it in a way that's going to be received.
The audience needs to hear it.
Right. And so depending on, we've all had these serious, emotionally wrought cases where victims, their families are affected profoundly.
People have been harmed.
And so you have to find a way to sort of stand up for the dignity of the client, but also not diminish the dignity of those who were also affected.
Sure.
And do that in a way that's going to be receptive or be heard, received by the person who's listening.
What were some things that you found to be helpful to move along that path, to get to that sanctuary? Maybe you weren't always successful, but to just get closer to that. Were there any things that you consciously aware of that you tried to be like, hey, here's what I need to do?
Just being aware of the uncomfortableness. Being comfortable being uncomfortable.
Being comfortable saying things to the judge, like you said in that day, like,
right.
Here's what you did here, here's what you didn't do here.
Right. And not coming at it as, you are a racist because you did it this way on this case.
Sure.
And you didn't do it this way for my client. That's not going to be received.
Yeah.
Being dispassionate and rational is like, well, here's what happened in this case. Here's what happened in this case. Whether or not this was intentional, my client has a view of it, and that is what's shaping his reality. Mm-hmm. Being able to create some emotional distance between the act and the result that you want to try to get.
Sure. Right. And time is obviously helpful in a lot of ways, but how that person spends the time, if they have to spend that time in custody,
right.
Our clients wanting to make things go faster.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help them necessarily because we want some time to dissipate some of the pain.
Right.
Some of the other. You'd been in a situation where you were the only person of color growing up in McAllister. You've grow into other areas where there were more people that look like you, that have your shared experiences. Now you're a public defender in the criminal justice system in Madison. And the reality is a lot of the defendants all look like you.
Right.
How did your own personal experience, how did your being a person of color impact that for them and or for you?
So I think, and I can't say this is going to be true for every single client that I represented, but I would like to think that, people would see somebody who looks like them and at least have a little bit more trust in the person. I will say that I certainly had experiences that were the opposite, where I would have a client of color who would not necessarily buy into me as their attorney because I didn't fit the archetype.
Sure.
I wasn't the old white guy.
Yeah.
With gray hair.
Yep.
And that's what the lawyer, that's what the lawyer is supposed to look like. So there was sort of that reversal.
Yeah. I mean, and even if it's not, trying to put ourselves in that person's shoes, it might not have been, they bought into the archetype, but they also maybe the power. I'm worried that because you look like me, you're going to have less power.
Right.
You're going to have less persuasion because this is a system in which white, gray-haired men are in control.
Right.
And you're not one of them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, being in the courtroom with, when I was a public defender with my client of color, and of course we are the only people that look like us in the entire courtroom,
Sure.
including the jury panel. For me, I would just dive into it. I can just say, look around the room. My client's worried that he might not get a fair shake because the only person who looks like him is me. Should he be worried about that? Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And I can lean into those kinds of things that, you'd have to do it a different way.
Sure.
But, I think the fact that I, had practiced here and had, I believe, a pretty good reputation amongst the judges and the prosecutors, that there was a certain level of authenticity and that I wasn't trying to be something that I'm not. And so when I would make an argument, I think it would be more well received because people know who I am and they know that, I'm not doing something to be dramatic or theatrical or just, bombastic.
Had you thought about being a judge for a long time? Is that something that just you evolved over time? Or tell us about the journey to becoming a judge.
Yeah, I never wanted to be a judge when I started.
Why is that?
As an attorney. It wasn't something I thought about. I liked what I was doing. I liked doing trial work. I liked, my colleagues in the public defender's office. And what started to change was, as I sort of got more years under my belt and had more confidence in myself, I thought, I'm getting tired of trying to convince someone to do what I think is right. I want to be the person making that decision.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the thought process that started moving me into the direction of considering being a judge.
Yeah. Because at least for me, I've only been a criminal defense attorney. All my career, 30 years, that's all I want to do. But yeah, as we talk about sanctuary, as I talk about it, I feel like maybe it's woe is me, but I feel like I'm the person with the least power to make it a sanctuary on a day-to-day basis. There might be different settings. Do you agree with that? Is that something that sounds like you would, as a premise, you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there is a power differential.
Yeah.
Whether that's good or bad or whatever is the case. I mean, the judge does carry a lot of authority with how things are run in the courtroom and what things are allowed or not allowed, and the tone of things. And that can make an experience pleasant. It can make an experience unpleasant.
Yeah.
And you might get the same result in both cases, but that experience can be really sometimes more important than the actual outcome.
Absolutely. It's not, I mean, we think about results, but the feeling that a person goes away from there is super important, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? And like, why is the feeling of your client in those instances when you were a public defender, or the feeling of the litigants, why is that important?
People want to be heard. People want to be listened to. And if people think that they were heard and they're listened to, then there's more buy-in on the result. Yeah, I didn't get what I wanted, but you know what? The judge listened to what I had to say. Versus he wasn't even paying attention.
Sure.
Did
you feel that the same when you were an attorney? I mean, was there some times when your role was to make sure that your client felt heard from you as the attorney?
Yeah, I mean, you'd like to think that as an attorney you are able to sort of convey your client's story. Sometimes you're better at it than some other times.
Sure.
And is the client satisfied with what happened or not satisfied? And is that because they felt like you didn't do as good a job, or the judge didn't listen? I mean, there's multi-dimensions there as far as what the client's going to come away with. I've had cases where, I have a good relationship with the client, get a horrible outcome, but the person's okay about it because they're like, well, you fought for me.
Yeah.
And
And why do you think that is important? I mean, for them to have that feeling that they were heard, that someone fought for them.
People, I think it's just one of those, no one wants to think that they just get thrown into this abyss with nothing to help them. And if they feel like, you know what, someone had my back, someone was there, someone was fighting for me, someone was there to sort of tell my story, then there's some level of vindication. And the result can sometimes just be secondary to that, and
sure.
I remember I had a trial with a guy who, it was a drunk driving trial. And it was a difficult trial, set of circumstances, and he was convicted, and I went to go see him right after the verdict in the jail, and, I felt horrible. I'm like, I lost this trial. I thought I was going to win this trial, and I lost. And, he didn't have that same mindset. Obviously he wasn't happy, but
sure.
It wasn't as though he was mad at me. He felt like we put up a fight.
Yeah.
And the chips fell where they fell.
And that I think you talked about it before when you were talking about the bond with your client. It may or may not be racist, but there's a perception of him being treated different based upon how he looks. This perception of fairness, I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a measurement maybe of fairness, but there's the perception of fairness. Do you feel like you're in a better position now as a judge to improve those perceptions?
I think so.
How so?
Because I can take the time, make the time, to allow someone to tell me what they want to tell me. When you have a case, obviously, if you've got a busy calendar, it's very difficult to kind of, you got to move things along. But there are moments where somebody just wants to vent.
Yeah.
That's all they want. And I've had instances where I've had defendants who they start and I think, okay, do I want to cut this off or just kind of let it play out? And more often than not, I'm like, okay, just let it go,
Yep.
And they talk. Finally, they're finished, and then I say whatever my piece is. And this is an actual example. This happened, and as the person was getting sent, they were going back into custody. The bailiff came up to me later and said, he was really appreciative of you because he felt like you listened to him.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't get what he wanted, he felt like, he at least got to say his piece.
Sure.
And sometimes that goes a long way to someone feeling that the system is not just out to get them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as a lawyer, right? I mean, I have different feelings than my client, right? I get to go home every night. I get to do things. But one of my frustrations, I'll just say, is you make an argument and you hear a decision and it doesn't even acknowledge some of the arguments you made. Not even I heard you, Mr. Nelson, I disagree with you. That's fine. Yeah. Just as simple as that sometimes, at least for me, goes a long way.
Yeah.
I heard your point. Here's why I disagree with you. And now here we've moved on, as opposed to just here's the result. And I'm like, okay, how'd we get there? Have you found that with lawyers and litigants as well?
Yeah. And I can't say that I do that every time.
Sure.
But there are certainly instances where I will say, you know what, I understand why you made this argument. It's not a frivolous argument.
Yeah.
I get why you're recommending this bail. I don't agree with it. I'm not going to follow it or, whatever. But, just to acknowledge, I haven't made up my mind before you've made your argument. I've listened to what you have to say. I appreciate that you made this argument. I'm not going to follow the whatever, But, just to acknowledge the fact that, because sometimes, as the lawyer, you might think, well, gee, was that just a completely stupid argument? Like, should I have never made those?
Yeah, right. I want to get better too.
Right.
And I want to know what's important to say, what's important not to say, all of those different things. Obviously, I have my own opinions.
Right.
But
right.
Unless you give me feedback, I'm just going to keep talking the way that I'm talking.
Right. Yeah.
Results can, but I don't know if, like you said, maybe it's a good argument. What, I saw in some of the research for this and some of the preparation, we read your application for an appointment because you got appointed you didn't win an election to begin with, you got an appointment.
Correct.
And what does one have to do to get appointed to be a judge here in Wisconsin?
So there's an application process, which is very lengthy. And then there's an interview process with the committee. At least under Governor Evers, he has a committee of attorneys across the state. And so after that process, I interviewed with the governor, then was offered the job.
One of our previous guests was Craig Mostentuno, who's on that committee.
Yep.
And he was sharing with us, and he took great pride in the efforts that the committee and the governor have made to make that pool of people, as well as the people that are ultimately selected, much more diverse and a reflection of the communities that they serve. Do you think that's important?
I think it is important. I think it's important for our justice system to look like the people that go through it, because you need people with different experiences, different lenses through which they see things. If you've never had to deal with hunger, if you've never had to deal with your lights being cut off, you've never had to deal with, I don't have a babysitter. I can't do this because I don't have someone to watch my kid. I have to bring my kid with me to my college classes.
Yeah.
I have to bring my kid with me to court because I don't have anything else. If you don't have that experience, then when you see something like that happen, you think, well, what are you doing this for? So that lens through which people see is important because it can inform how an ultimate decision is made. And so to have that variety and those different viewpoints, I can talk with a colleague about something and give my perspective because of my own experience that they don't have, and that can inform them. The same that, their experience, can inform a decision that I make because I don't have that same experience that they had. That's important.
And when I hear you say that, I hear we're going to get to better results, right? Because we're going to have more perspectives. We're going to get to better results. I think so. But there's also another part of that is just the process is better. Can you tell me a little bit more about why just improving the process, even if it doesn't change the result? Why do you think that's important?
Sometimes the process is more than the result. You want to feel like the person wants to feel like they were heard. The person wants to feel like the process is fair. The person doesn't want to feel as though this is just some, assembly line, cookie cutter, one size fits all, everybody gets, this. There has to be some level of nuance and individualized approach to things. And so if you have a process that is filled with people that just have one particular viewpoint, then the person who comes through that process who doesn't share that viewpoint is not going to feel like they were really anything more than just a cog.
Yeah. I think in our world we call that procedural fairness.
Yeah.
And the studies that, I don't know if you're aware of them, but some of the studies that I've seen that actually the more procedural fairness is received, it reduces recidivism. Are you familiar with any of that?
Yeah, and I think some of it has to do with just, the buy-in into legitimacy of the system. If you feel like the system is legitimate because you felt as though you were treated fairly, then you're going to be more accepting of what the result is.
And then more willing to deal with the consequences and perhaps modify your behavior.
Right, right. And if you don't, if you just felt like, well, no one listened to what I had to say, no one cared about what I had to say, then what is the motivation to not do something bad in the future?
They're going to think of me as this way no matter what.
Exactly.
I may as well just be what they think I am.
Right.
I mean, that's how I see it from the outside, is like you're giving this person no incentive to change their behavior because you've labeled them and cut them off and made them an outsider.
Right. And I say this more often than not in sentencing when I'm speaking with a defendant. And I think it's important for them to know this, that you are not just what brought you here today. You are not just the charges that you pled guilty to.
Yeah.
There's more to you. You've got family members that are sitting behind you. Even though you've had all these things, you've had all these past, experiences, there are still people that show up for you. That says something.
Absolutely.
And it's important that a person hears that. And I also, acknowledge, especially if there's a victim crime, I get your reaction. I get why you feel the way you feel. I would probably feel the same way if I was in your position. I think it's natural. It's human. It's just, your feelings are valid. I feel like I do a lot of sort of validation of people, but I think people need to hear that, and I think it's an appropriate thing for me as a judge to say. I can acknowledge all of those things, and I can still hold the person accountable.
Sure. In a way that's not as blameworthy, perhaps, that I feel like it pulls them forward as opposed to pushing them, right?
And you don't have to be mean about it.
Yeah. Now, you talked before, obviously about a different world. People are coming into this world, right? As a judge, that's your world. You work there every day. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, we're used to certain things, right? Oftentimes, people accused of crimes, it might be a new world to them. Sometimes it might be a familiar world to them for whatever reason because of the trauma that they've had. But often, much more often, the victims, it's an absolutely new world for them to come in. What do you think is the responsibility of defense counsel or judges to explain this world to those newcomers, including victims? Because, they have victims advocates and they have prosecutors, but I worry sometimes if they're sharing the message about this world and why it's taking so longer and everything else. And like all of us have a responsibility to reduce the tension, to reduce that pressure. Do you feel that as a judge that there's any responsibility that you have to just explain the system to the victims as well?
I think I do.
Okay.
As a judge. And I try to acknowledge that when I have very serious, especially very serious cases where there's a victim and their family, and just say, I get that this process is slow and it sometimes is not very compassionate. We might have a day-long motion hearing on various legal topics, and the family or the victim might be in court listening to the lawyers make arguments about what evidence should or shouldn't come in. And it just sounds very sterile, without any sort of emotion. And I have just sort of taken upon myself to explain, I understand this whole process. We've been talking about this in a very sort of clinical way. And I get that it's not the most welcoming or compassionate method, but it's important. We have to do this because ultimately we have to get the case resolved in a way that we want it resolved. We don't want to do it again.
Yeah, sure.
And so I feel like for me, I can take that opportunity and explain that. Obviously, the DA's office has the victim witness person. They have that opportunity to make those same sort of statements, and they have more interaction.
Yeah. And they may or may not be the messengers in that same way.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not a party to that.
Right. Yeah,
so I just don't know.
Right.
Do you find that to be helpful? Have you seen, just even anecdotally through your experience, that you're having these conversations with victims has, dissipated the emotion, dissipated some of the anger, helped them process or feel in a way that I think ultimately we want them to?
I don't know, because I don't get sort of post-case feedback.
Yep.
On what people think as far as what happened with process. So I don't know. I would like to think that there's at least some level of that, but I don't know. Yeah.
As a defense attorney, I worry sometimes that there's been harm on the other side, right? Somebody has been harmed, and there's no doubt about that harm. But there's a process that we have to go to, and then we eventually get to sentence, and maybe my client's taking responsibility for all of the harm, some of the harm, a part of the harm. But it's taken so long that it's created stronger feelings, because the victims are like, how come it took so long for somebody to issue an apology? And you and I know, well, there's no vehicle for that to happen before now. But the public doesn't know that, and that creates some very passionate, strong feelings. What do you think we as a system can do better to help with that?
Yeah, that's hard, because, I certainly have had instances when I was a defense attorney, and I've certainly have been told by other defense attorneys who have said in sentencing, my client has been apologetic from day one, but there's just no way for him to convey that until this day. And there's lots of reasons why. You might be litigating some issues that legally might reduce culpability, that don't necessarily have to do with factual culpability, but legal culpability. And you put yourself in a position where you might undermine that if there are certain statements that are made. But people don't know that. People just assume that, this apology is now being done at the last minute, and it's just something that was just cooked up to try to get sympathy, when that might not be the case.
Do you think there's room for us to create a space for that beforehand, even, or an opportunity for that?
So I think if there were more of restorative justice, then that might be the vehicle to do that.
Yeah.
But it's hard in, your really serious cases to even think about doing something like that.
I just think of in cases now, I'm by point in my career where a lot of times now I'm dealing with cases where there's a death. There's a death. Somebody has suffered an incredible loss, and we know that there's been that loss. That fact isn't going away, right? And that's a fact that's impacted somebody. But legal culpability, moral culpability might have something. It might even be that my client was clearly the driver. But I wish that we could get to that restorative justice pre-plea in some ways.
Right.
And I don't know, I'm struggling to try to figure that out. And I feel like we just don't do a good job of that, and we need to. It's our responsibility to try to figure that out, because we can get them there sooner, and that's going to help everybody. That's going to make your job easier. It's going to make the DA's job easier. It's going to make my job easier if there's just less suffering, less pain.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know, any words of wisdom, any thoughts on how we can do that pre-plea in some way, or set up an environment in which there's less anger at the sentencing, right?
I mean, I wish I had an answer, because it is important.
Yeah.
There's real value in an apology. And
absolutely.
If that could be delivered, it would go a long way to healing.
Yeah.
But the way we have things set up, the adversarial system, it's just not conducive to that. And I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah. Well, it might be just what you talked about, just even acknowledging some of this, communicating with the victims in a way that recognizes them and understands and just teaches them about our world. Is that something that you've just done on your own naturally? Is that something that they're promoting more at judicial colleges or within, the back chambers in Dane County? Why do you think it is that you've come to do that?
I think it's just a product of having been in the defense chair and now on the bench. And it's been evolving. When I first started, I don't think I was taking the time to sort of think about those things because I was learning the job.
Yeah.
And now that I've been in this role for 6 years, I can think about those things and acknowledge those things, and also just, being more confident in the job and the mechanics of the foundational stuff with the law, and then, okay, now that I have that under control, I can sort of start thinking about these more esoteric things that really probably have more impact than.
It's maybe like math. You got to learn the math first,
right,
before you can transfer that knowledge onto the person you're tutoring or the person that you're teaching. For a long time, you're learning the content of being a judge,
right?
And now you're learning the translation skills. You're getting to those points that you can pass that on, right?
Yeah.
As just one more area here, as a criminal defense attorney, oftentimes I'm trying to humanize my client. I'm trying to make sure somebody sees who my client is, right? Sees them in, as you say, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, not just the 2-dimensional text. And I know you did that as a criminal defense attorney as well. I've been in front of judges in my career that, while I think they appreciate that, they're also lean into being removed. I need to be objective. I need to not do that. And it almost sometimes feels as if they're distancing themselves from the humanity of what they're doing. I don't know whether that's because they think that improves their decision making, if it's a protection for them because like there's some hard shit that you need to do as a judge, and it's probably hard to connect. How do you deal with that as a judge? Because I want you to see him. I want you to get down there and like touch his hand before you do him harm, because I think that's going to make it less likely that you're going to do him harm. And again, I know it's metaphorical here, but how do you balance that? How do you see that?
So for me, the more I can know about someone, the better.
Okay.
I like more information. And that's true of defendant, that's true of victim, that's true of, anyone that comes in. Because I think it's important.
Yeah.
I think it's important that if I'm going to be sending someone to prison, that I know who the person is.
Sure.
Or at least have been given the opportunity to try to know who the person is. It's not, in my view, fair to be sort of distant and, not acknowledging the humanity of someone that is going away to prison. I need to know that humanity.
Yeah.
It's important for me to know it. It's important for me to acknowledge it. It's important for that person to know that I acknowledge it, because to the extent that there might be just some little bit of spark that my comments have to either prevent the person from being in that same spot in the future, or at least help guide them, in the next phase of wherever they are, I'd much rather have that ability than just not at all.
Sure. Just like an attorney who comes there and needs to show character and ethos to get credibility. It sounds like you're saying as a judge, you have a position that just gives it to you, but your words are empty unless you can show the listener.
Right.
Same thing. It's almost the same role. Like you have to establish your credibility with your audience, which is oftentimes my client.
Right.
And to do that is to just acknowledge their humanity.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. Well, last question, right? What, at the end of the day, like some of the work that you do, right? Sentencing is the most difficult work that anyone could imagine. Like, what motivates you to come to work every day to do the job that you're doing?
I think I'm an optimist.
Okay.
I'd like to think that, there is some good that's going to come out of the day of work that I have.
Yeah.
What that is, I don't know. Sometimes I don't necessarily see it right away. As a teacher, you don't really see the fruits of your labor until years later sometimes.
Sure.
And so that's kind of the thing that kind of gets me going, is that I'm hopeful that, I have these sometimes brief interactions with individuals and I may never see them again. But I would just like to think that there is something that came through the process that helped them in some measurable way.
Sometimes it just takes a 1 degree nudge in one direction that gets them gets them turning in the right path.
Absolutely.
And I imagine you're somebody that occasionally gives that nudge.
I do my best.
Well, thank you for joining us here.
Yeah,
this has been wonderful. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to Sanctuary in the Jungle. This episode was brought to you with the help of May Daly and Nelson Defense Group. If you haven't already, be sure to check out our companion articles on Substack. With every episode, I take a deeper dive into the topic at hand, applying the theme to real cases and issues, sharing how it helped me to improve my practice. If you want to learn more, subscribe at sanctuaryinthejungle.substack.com. That's sanctuaryinthejungle.substack.com. We'll see you next time at the library. Until then, stay strong and carry the hope.